Hello guys, we are back in new fanfic, and if enjoying this then please share and like part 1. Now let's start the fanfic. The first sensation that came back to Ino was that of warmth and comfort. The sluggish firing of her pre-awake neurons was not capable of registering anything but physical sensations at the moment, and what she felt was a bone-deep weariness. The type of exhaustion that comes from having pushed the body well past its physical limitations, a familiar friend to most shinobi, but oddly enough Ino felt rather content. It was the same feeling of having become aware of being awake on a cold winter morning where even without stepping out of bed you knew it was freezing cold, but you also knew you didn't have anywhere to go or anything to do, so you could just snuggle deeper into your covers. And snuggle closer to her source of warmth she did, squirming closer to the strong pair of arms draped around her body. There was a momentary pause as her mind finally processed her own observations. Slowly she cracked an eye open to take in her surroundings. The first most notable thing was the fact that she was most definitely not in her own room. The second being that the room she was in was trashed. Items and knick-knacks were scattered around the room, as were a number of articles of clothing, many of which were recognizably hers. Oh yes, the dark lacy panties strung over the chair was definitely hers. A wooden chair near the window letting in the beams of sunlight through the closed drapes had been tipped over, and the drawers to a standing dresser had been pulled out and even torn out in one case. A desk stood neatly in a corner, the stationery that it held scattered across the floor as if someone had swept the tabletop in a hasty desire to clear it, and a dark beanbag chair lay ripped open with its fillings spilling out from its guts in a foamy mess. The mattress of the bed was half hanging off the frame a little ways from where her blanketed foot lay, but most distracting was the feeling of someone else's bare legs pressed up against hers. Oh look, she ideally thought, I think those are condoms. In fact, there were quite a few of the condemning little plastic rubbers scattered around and across the floor, winking back innocently at her in silent testament to her activities the night before. Shifting her body so she could pull back and take a look at who she had apparently decided to lose her virginity to on a whim, she was rewarded with a grunt before she could sneak a peek at her bedmate. Turning her head and looking up, she was rewarded with a pair of blue eyes gazing blearily back at hers. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came out as she stared back at her former rival's teammate. While Naruto had never been particularly bad-looking, he wasn't exactly going to win any beauty pageants when he was younger, his most distinguishing feature being those deep soulful eyes of his. But that had quickly changed after his little 3-year stint off in the world with Jiraiya. The boy had returned home quite the man and had become the talk of the women in the village. Whispers and giggles followed the clueless blonde around wherever he went, hungry eyes eating up his backside as he walked. Even Sakura, whom everyone was pretty sure was still absolutely hung up over the treacherous Uchiha, could be seen eyeing the blonde whenever she thought no one would notice, which amusingly enough quite a few people didn't fail to notice. The irresistible baby blue eyes that had trapped Ino's own gaze held a warmth and amusement to them that should have been pissing her off to no end, seeing the circumstances of how they had apparently gotten together, but she just couldn't bring herself to break away from the feeling of utter satisfaction coursing through her body at the moment. Hi. His morning voice was a deeper husk than his usual rough timbre, sending a shiver down Ino's spine as she felt her skin break out into gooseflesh from his tone. Hi. She returned with a quirk of her lips. His eyes finally released hers to gaze around the room, his eyebrows shooting upwards much to her amusement. Naruto pushed his upper body up to get a better look, taking Ino up with him slightly as she had been resting lazily against his rather well-defined chest. Finally he looked back down, meeting her gaze with a sheepish smile. Some night, huh? He asked. Unable to force her widening smile into a scowl she really felt should be directed at the man responsible for taking her virginity, Ino blew a stray strand of hair from her bangs out of her face. Some night, she replied through half-lidded eyes. We should probably talk, Naruto. Why don't you go take a shower while I clean up and make us? Here he paused to take a look at the alarm clock on the bedside, air lunch apparently. Okay. Ino sat up and rolled off her blonde companion, taking the thin bed sheets with her to cover her body. The curvy blonde took a moment to cast an appreciative gaze at her friend's exposed body, but she felt her eyes widen as her sightseeing strayed below his waist. While she had seen diagrams and videos of what the male organ was supposed to look like erect, she had never seen it in person before, and certainly they had never been quite that big. Naruto flushed with embarrassment at his saluting member, unsure of exactly what he was supposed to do. It certainly wasn't his first time sleeping with a woman, but this was the first time he'd done it after being blackout drunk and with a friend no less. On second thought, why don't I use the bathroom first? He mumbled as he stood up. Ino burst into a fit of giggles that she failed to cover up with her hand at the rather large throbbing protrusion waving about in her face. Yeah, you look like you could use a cold shower or two. Flushing slightly, the blonde male hurried on to the bathroom, unaware of the pair of teal eyes glued to his firm buttocks. Oh Ino, the blonde teen murmured to herself as she heard the shower turn on. What have you gotten yourself into, girl? Stepping out of the steaming shower, Ino was surprised at the state of tidiness of the torn-up room she had left behind just 20 minutes prior. All the randomly strewn clothing had either vanished or, in the case of her clothes, neatly folded and left on the bed whose mattress had finally nestled back into its frame. The furniture had all been put back to a more respectable location, and the majority of the trash had ended up in the now rather full waste bin between the desk and doorway. Smiling to herself slightly as she could hear and smell the sizzling of something delicious wafting in through the doorway, the blonde Yamanaka dropped the towel wrapped around her body to reach for her clothes on the bed. Of course, the moment the towel touched the floor was when she heard the rapping noise from the entryway to the bedroom. Turning, she faced her blonde lover who was currently leaning up against the doorframe, arms crossed and eyes most definitely not averted. Hey, he murmured while his gaze continued to roam across Ino's body in a notably hungry manner. Thought I'd let you know that lunch was ready. Fighting back an instinctive urge to blush and cover up, Ino instead placed a hand on her hip, turning so that she was even more exposed. Two could play at this game. Message received. Can I help you with anything else? She asked with a smirk. Naruto chuckled, the soft predatory laugh sending a shiver down Ino's spine. Just admiring the lovely view, he murmured huskily, his baby blues locked onto hers. This time Ino could not quite repress the blush that came to her cheeks. Snatching the towel holding her drying hair up, she hurled it at the blonde, causing him to duck out of the doorframe with a laugh. Hurry up, Ino-chan, his playful voice echoed as he headed back towards the kitchen, food's getting cold. Muttering to herself about perverted boys, Ino quickly put on the rest of her clothes, using the large towel previously used to cover her body to hastily dry her hair. Walking into kitchen, she found herself surrounded by the wonderful scent of freshly brewed coffee along with the sight of a meal fit for royalty laid out on the rather sparse dining table. Coffee. Ino nodded wordlessly at Naruto as she took a seat at the table, noting that the food was actually quite delicious looking, something she had not expected from him. For a guy who had lived alone all his life and practically survived off a diet of ramen, he was apparently a decent cook. Correction, Ino thought as she took her first bite and her taste buds practically cried out in ecstasy, an amazing cook. Taking the offered cup of brown brew from Naruto, she added some cream and sugar until the color was to her liking before taking a sip of the hot coffee. Watching the blonde male bustle about putting things into the sink, she couldn't help but smirk slightly at the domestic scene. Just how many people knew this side of him? Or got to see it? Thought you were making us lunch? She asked after blowing on her coffee to cool it some. I lied, he replied with a charming smile that showed oversized canines as he finally joined her at the table. Hope you don't mind the Western-style breakfast I laid out. Found a taste for it while traveling with Jiraiya. Ino certainly had no complaints. There were a stack of golden brown pancakes piled half a dozen high, its varying color and texture suggesting a mixture of nuts and fruits in the batter that she couldn't wait to get a taste of. Her own plate was made up of some perfectly cooked scrambled eggs, not too runny but not hitting rubbery either, with a mixture of some salted meats and other vegetables lending the yellow concussions a nice appetizing color. There were also pile of potatoes rubbed with some sort of herb she was not familiar with, all mixed in with shredded corned beef. Along the side was a slice of ham with dark brown griddle lines that still wafted steam, some strips of juicy thick-cut bacon that glistened with grease, and half a dozen finger-sized sausage links grilled to perfection. There was a dish for butter between them, along with salt, pepper, and small flask of honey along with a bottle of store-bought ketchup. 2 glasses of orange juice was placed within reach of the 2 diners along with a medium glass jug filled with more of the cool fruit juice. A small woven basket with a red and white plated cover made up the centerpiece of the table, and based off the heat and smell it was most likely filled with fresh baked bread. Taking another bite of her food, Ino fought back a groan of pleasure as her taste buds triggered all sorts of pleasant reward pathways in her brain. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" she demanded as she shoveled down another forkful. "If you ever quit being a ninja, you should go be a chef." Cracking a smile, the blonde male prepped his own coffee, which mainly consisted of a spoonful of sugar and a dash of cream. He liked his strong. "Why is everyone always surprised when they learn that I can cook?" Ino waved her fork in his face as she swallowed another before answering. "Well duh, mister, I eat nothing but ramen. You ate nothing but ichirakus when you were younger. The natural assumption would be that you can't cook to save your life." Chuckling as he buttered the bread roll he had taken out of the basket, Naruto grunted in satisfaction as he sank his teeth into the warm hearty grain. "About the only pleasure in life you can afford as an orphan is good food," he replied with a careless shrug. "I got good at cooking real young. I just went to Ichiraku so I wouldn't have to be alone." Feeling her own spirits dim somewhat at the reminder of her friend's difficult childhood, Ino continued eating the delicious meal, albeit at a slower pace. "I can't imagine what that was like," she said sadly as she recalled how she had not exactly been the kindest person to the blonde seated across from her when they were younger. Surprisingly, Naruto simply laughed it off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Don't worry about it, Ino-chan. Leave the past in the past. I'm doing all right now and I've got you guys." Smiling at his infectious grin and genuinely upbeat outlook on life, Ino resolved not to bring the mood down with her own feelings. The two continued eating in companionable silence, quickly demolishing the enormous breakfast set out before them. They made idle chit-chat for a while about all sorts of random topics, Naruto regaling her with tales from his exploits under the tutelage of the Toad Hermit, and Ino in turn filling him in with all the latest village gossip. "Really?" shouted Naruto after he had finally cleared his throat from a choking fit he had suffered through after Ino had dropped a bombshell on him while he had been drinking juice. "Kakashi-sensei and the snake lady. Why, they make a cute couple," defended Ino. "You the man, Kakashi," mumbled Naruto while wiping his mouth. "Must have a brass pair. She's not that bad once you get to know her," laughed Ino. Seeing the disbelieving look directed at her across the table, the Yamanaka crossed her arm in a huff. "Seriously, she's a bit exuberant, but once you get past that, she's nice enough." Unable to sustain a straight face while being confronted with Naruto's silly look of disbelief, the blonde girl broke into a fit of giggles. "Stop it." "Stop what?" he asked innocently as he grinned back at her from across the rim of his glass of juice. "That." Curling his lip, he gave a distorted sneer back at her, causing her to erupt into a new bout of laughter. The two blondes fell into a cycle of triggering each other's laughter with their own. After a few minutes they finally managed to pause long enough to catch their breaths. "So," began Naruto, "about last night." Instantly all the levity left the table, replaced by an awkwardness that hung in the air like a sticky fog. "Right. There was still that giant white elephant parading in the room, waving its in their face, waiting to be dealt with." Ino couldn't help but stare down at her lap in embarrassment as the subject turned to the events of the night before. "How much do you remember?" he asked tentatively. Heat flooded Ino's cheeks as his question triggered exactly what she had been trying very hard not to think about. Most of the night had been a relative blur. She had gone to a party to celebrate Asuma finally proposing to Kurenai, cementing their relationship for good. Somewhere along the way she had hit it off with Naruto rather well, and apparently she had followed him home and taken resident in his bed. The rest was evident in the state of the room they had woken in. Not much. Well, that wasn't the entire truth. While the sequence of events was relatively hazy, what was clear in her memory were the activities that had taken place once they had gotten home. It was very apparent from the snatches of what she could recall that Naruto was a very intense and frighteningly focused lover. All that energy he directed into training that allowed him to often tunnel vision to his goals was focused solely for her pleasure the night before, and what little results she could still remember was enough to elicit an embarrassing dampness between her thighs as her crotch ached with desire, her body singing its want to repeat the dirty deeds of the night before. But don't worry, she continued hastily. I won't tell Sakura. The blonde male stared back blankly for a moment before raising his eyebrows in confusion. Thanks. Really though, isn't that the sort of things girls share with each other? Don't let me stop you if you feel like it. Well, I wouldn't want to ruin your chances with forehead, she teased back. The confusion on his face deepened if possible, before understanding flooded it. Well, actually, Ino, I was thinking that maybe you and I could give it a try. Ino froze at his words as she considered her friend sitting across the table. This was not what she had expected as a conversation after a night of drunken passion. Maybe an apology or even another quick tryst between the sheets, but certainly not a proposition for an actual relationship. What? She squeaked. But I thought you still liked Sakura. The blonde leaned back against his chair and made a thoughtful noise in the back of his throat. Well, yeah, I did, but I had a lot of time to think about it during my trip with Erosenin, and I've decided to put that behind me. We have a strong friendship that I don't want to jeopardize for something stupid, and to be perfectly honest, I don't think we'd make a good couple anyways. Ino continued to stare blankly at Naruto sitting calmly across from her, patiently waiting for her response. Finally, she burst into a fit of laughter, grasping her knees with her hands to steady herself as her body shook with mirth. Naruto continued to observe her from his position through bemused eyes. Care to let me in on the joke, Ino-chan? Okay, she gasped out. You got me, Naruto. Good one. She wiped a tear from her eye as another fit of giggles burst uncontrollably from her lips. I'm not joking, Ino. Staring back into serious blue eyes, Ino's brain felt like it was short-circuiting. Crossing her arms on the table, she allowed her head to fall onto them with a dull thunk. Naruto, you're confused, she said in a muffled voice through her arms. We had some great, fantastic, and now you're convinced you're in love with me. It doesn't work that way. Of course it doesn't work that way, he laughed. And I'm not in love with you. I've put a lot of time and thought into it, Ino. Fact is, I don't think I ever liked Sakura for the right reason. I decided long before I came back that I would settle for our friendship and move on, and I have. This wasn't exactly my first time. It was mine, mumbled Ino, still in her prone position. Hearing the momentary pause, Ino peeked out between her arms, shielding her face to see Naruto's stunned expression. What? He spluttered. She glared back at him defiantly, feeling her anger rise at his disbelief. And what's that supposed to mean? You think I'm some airheaded that spreads her legs for every guy that manages to sweep me off my feet? Was I just an easy lay? She demanded in a dangerous tone. No, that's not it. Protested Naruto with his hands raised defensively. I just thought a beautiful smart girl like you would have had a chance for a more serious relationship. Hell, I'd jump at a chance to just take you out on a date, Ino-chan. Ino turned her eyes aside in embarrassment at his frank assessment of her. Truth was, she had more than her share of dates and guys lined up to take her out and no doubt try to get in her pants. Call her a hopeless romantic, but it had just never felt right to move beyond some kissing and heavy petting with someone who wasn't invested in an actual relationship with her. Well, until last night anyways, though it seems Naruto was actually considering a relationship, something she couldn't quite wrap her brain around. She felt her hands being tugged into a larger pair. His hands were warmer than hers and she could feel calluses on his palms through the searing heat of his flesh, evident of his hard work ethic. Looking up into his blue eyes so full of honesty, Ino couldn't help but flush a little as she felt her body physically react with desire to his rather dominating presence. Look, Ino, he said softly, I'm not demanding anything here. Just give me a chance to take you out. I feel bad enough that we slept together while drunk, and I'd be lying if said the thoughts never crossed my mind, but I never meant to take away your first time when it should have been with someone special. I don't know if I can make that up to you or become that someone special for you, but I'd love to give it a try. Here he smiled, that sweet gentle smile of his, and tightened his hold on her hands, causing a warm pit to open up in her stomach. Butterflies. Hell, they were more like dragonflies. You're a beautiful and intelligent woman that I've always managed to have a lot of fun around, he continued with a genuine grin. Give me a chance to get to know you better. Ino stuttered a bit as her brain failed to come up with a proper response to that. She'd heard it all before, of course. Men of all ages praised her for her beauty and skill. Hell, she'd even had her share of young men serenading her. But never had anyone delivered it with such blatant honesty while looking her straight in the eye without turning their gaze. The tender smile that graced his face as he rubbed circles into the back of her hand with his thumbs caused Ino's insides to melt, and suddenly a very large part of her could not help but wonder why the hell not. I know it's not something you can just give me an answer to on the spot, Naruto continued as he pulled up her hands and brushed her knuckles with a gentle kiss from his lips, unknowingly fanning the desire building up in the young woman rooted to her chair. Why don't you take some time to think about it and we can talk about it again later, okay? Still not trusting herself to form words, Ino simply nodded once and got up from her seat before she fled from Naruto's kitchen. Sakura blew out a sigh of resignation as she finished lecturing the senior man sitting contritely on the paper-covered patient bed about the necessity of taking his medication on time. Honestly, sometimes she wondered what people were thinking. The labels on the pill bottles handed to him a week before when he came in for pneumonia were as clear as instructions could be: take 2 tablets together after every meal. How anyone managed to forget such simple directions when their own life was at risk was truly astounding. After finally relenting in her gentle scolding of the embarrassed elder, she shooed him out with another reminder not to forget to take his medication if he didn't want to have his upper respiratory infection to have a sudden relapse. Scratching away with her pen on the patient form the date and reasons for the visit, she completed the 6 pages of micro font with the ease of someone who had done it hundreds of times before. Making sure the room was as neat as she had found it for the next doctor, she headed back out into the hallway, exchanging a greeting and an eye roll with another doctor who had given her a knowing look. It hadn't been the man's first return visit, and Sakura was willing to bet her month's hospital salary it wouldn't be his last. The pink-haired teenager weaved through the number of patients and hospital staff, making a beeline for the sign-in station. There she filed away her paperwork under her patient's rather extensive file, and made a note in the computer along with the physical copies being archived away. Hard at work, Sakura-chan, chided the kindly matron who was the head nurse of the entire Konoha hospital, a rather prestigious position. A young girl like you should take more time off to have fun with her friends. Sakura laughed as she brushed a stray pink lock from her face and behind her ear. The older woman routinely admonished her for her diligent work habits, but the kunoichi knew the other woman did so in jest. I have plenty of fun with my friends, Masiaki-san. In fact, it's our girls' night out tonight. The older woman clucked her tongue in a reproving fashion, spinning in her wheelie chair so that she could glare playfully at the younger girl. Oh, that's all good, Sakura-chan, but I'm talking about the sort of fun that involves boys your age. What about that young man who's always visiting you at work? There's a strapping young lad I would have jumped in an instant if I was 10 years younger. Color flooded Sakura's cheeks as she looked determinedly anywhere but at the nurse. Masiaki-san, she exclaimed, scandalized. You're married. Well, that makes it more fun, doesn't it? Asked the other woman with a cheeky grin. Though in all seriousness, why haven't you thrown the poor boy a bone? Does he have a woman already? Naruto-kun is a teammate, and just a friend, growled Sakura firmly, even as her belly did a small familiar flop as it was so often prone to doing whenever her thoughts strayed to the blonde as of late. Naruto-kun, huffing out in annoyance at the teasing Sakura snorted and tossed her hair back imperiously. Yes, Masiaki-san, a friend. Chuckling, the older woman raised her hands up in surrender and turned back to her own pile of paperwork waiting for attention. If you say so, Sakura-chan. But don't stay in denial too long. A boy like that will be snapped up very quickly by other women if you're not careful. Heat still burning her cheeks, Sakura left the information desk, uncertain as to why her colleague's last statement had left a sinking feeling in her gut. Stewing slightly in her own emotions, she made a beeline for the general admissions desk where she was scheduled to spend her last 4 hours administering to the basic requests of patients who didn't necessarily require an in-depth session to determine their needs. While usually a duty fulfilled by nurses, there was always a doctor on hand to serve as a reference point for when more information or attention was necessary, though given how busy it was, the doctor on call usually ended up working alongside the nurses. Making her way across the hospital, Sakura had the time to really reflect on her relationship with her remaining teammate. It had been more than half a year since Naruto had returned from his training trip with Jiraiya, and in that time their friendship had strengthened well beyond anything they had before he left. Sakura had been surprised by how much she had missed the goofball while he had been away. Naruto had always had a way of cheering her up at just the right moment with his bright and admittedly often very loud personality, something she sorely missed over the past 3 years. She had kept her focus on her studies, but more than once she had wished her blonde-haired teammate had been around. His return had heralded a much more quiet though no less positive personality change and a deeper maturity than most people had thought him possible. And when Sakura could put aside fighting the butterflies in her own stomach long enough to be objective about it, then yes, even she could see how much more handsome the blonde had become. Gone was the baby fat, replaced by lean hard muscle that rippled subtly beneath his clothing regardless of what he was wearing, and a face that had left behind childhood in favor of a more masculine overtone. The shorter than average blonde had shot up into a broad-shouldered male whose height and width was only matched by Kiba out of all the men in their graduating year. Sakura was still getting used to having to look up when talking to her teammate. There was also a certain hardness in his eyes that hadn't been present before. The way he carried himself screamed of a change she couldn't quite put her finger on, but when their eyes did meet she often felt a shiver down her spine. She still wasn't sure if it was a good one. Arriving at the station, Sakura was so lost in her thoughts that she ran headlong into the nurse leaving her shift. Being a kunoichi, Sakura easily regained her balance, but the other woman was not so skilled and tumbled to the floor with a squeak of fright. Fuchio-san. I'm so sorry, exclaimed Sakura as she reached down to help the other nurse. I should have been paying more attention to where I was going. Are you alright? Mito Fuchio was only a year or two older than Sakura herself, but boasted a bust line that could have rivaled Tsunade's, something that Sakura was secretly rather envious of. Coupled with an almost inhuman hourglass-shaped figure and a face that would not have looked out of place on a magazine cover, it was no secret why she was the favorite nurse amongst the male patients at the hospital. With that sort of a body, it would have been no surprise if the other female staff would dislike her simply for that, but she had such a sweet, disarming personality that even the most grudge-prone individual would have trouble disliking her. Oh, Sakura-san, I didn't see you there, she laughed as she regained her feet with Sakura's help. I'm alright, just a bit of a fright from out little bump in there. The other girl's laugh was infectious and Sakura found herself giggling as well. Are you off your shift soon, Fuchio-san? Oh please, Sakura-san, no need to be so formal. Call me Mito. In fact, I'm off as soon as I sign out. Smiling at the other nurse who had her clipboard clutched to her rather voluptuous chest, Sakura gave a polite bow. Of course, Mito-san. I hope you have a nice afternoon. Sakura-san, I had a question I was hoping you could answer. Sakura looked on with curious eyes as the other woman seemed to suddenly take on a bashful posture, hooking her hands behind her back and looking down on the ground. How can I help you, Mito-san? The kunoichi asked encouragingly. Unlike shinobi, civilians she found often had to be prompted when they mean to ask for something. You are teammates with Naruto-kun, correct? Fighting the sudden unease that had filled her form, Sakura nodded slowly in affirmation. Is he single? The rather blunt and unexpected question left Sakura's mouth hanging slightly as Mito continued avoiding her gaze, a hint of pink flooding her cheeks. Wah! Spluttered Sakura incoherently. You Naruto, huh? The chesty nurse bit her lip and turned sad eyes up to look at the kunoichi. It's hard for me to find an honest man, harder still to find one who can speak to me while looking me in the eyes rather than, well, elsewhere. I've had chance to talk with Naruto-kun a few times while he visited you here, and I'd like the chance to get to know him better if there isn't a woman in his life already. Sincere though the words were, there was a hint of a challenging look in her eyes that Sakura couldn't quite place. Of course that didn't stop her hackles from rising slightly. Ruthlessly crushing the sudden surge of aggression, Sakura mentally shook her head to get her bearings. Well, she said hesitantly, as far as I know he's single. The worried expression on Mito's face brightened up like a ray of sunshine through rain clouds. Smiling happily, the other girl bowed to Sakura with an exclamation of thanks before heading off with a wave of her hand, humming softly as she left. Sakura stood there watching the other woman's retreating back, trying desperately to relax the clenched fist her free hand had unconsciously formed. Breathing out a disbelieving sigh, Sakura decided to put the event behind her, cataloging her reaction to the unexpected news of her colleague's attraction to her teammate to be sorted through and examined at a later time. Marching into the desk station, Sakura penned in her name and time at the sign-in board, giving a nod of greeting to the other hospital worker before snatching up the next client form. The name on the top of the paper caused her eyebrows to shoot up as she recognized her longtime rival's untidy scrawl even without the need to see Ino Yamanaka in the name box. Flipping through the pages of personal information that was standard for all patients to fill out, she got to the point of the reason for the visit. Sakura's jaws dropped again as she saw the paperwork signed with Ino's unmistakable signature for the morning after pill. Ino. Her normally neutral announcer voice when calling out the next patient's name came out more as a disbelieving cry that startled most the patients in the waiting room into looking at the pink-haired kunoichi. Barely noticing the reproachful look her superior was giving her, Sakura spotted her blonde friend in the crowd as the other kunoichi had looked up at the call of her name. Ino for her part had taken one look at Sakura before uttering an audible groan and dropping her head into her hands before standing up and closing in on her friend at the desk. Ino, Sakura hissed in a much lower voice once her friend was closer, what the hell? Morning after pill, who did you? The blonde kunoichi whose casual strut up to the station had attracted more than one stray eye to her shapely behind groaned again. Look, it's a long story. I'll tell you guys tonight when we get together, alright? I need your opinions on something anyways. Shaking her head in disbelief, Sakura hurriedly grabbed the proper medication, double-checking the dosage label before popping out 2 of the green pills and handing it to her friend along with a paper cup filled to the brim with water. What happened to waiting for the right man? Sakura demanded. You weren't dating anyone last I checked. The blonde tossed back the pills with a gulp of the water and winced at the way the medication rattled in her esophagus on the way down, washing away her discomfort with the remaining water. Well, obviously that went out the window, grumbled Ino as she crushed the paper cup and tossing it in a nearby waste basket. Throwing her long blonde hair back over her shoulder, Ino leaned down onto the desk station with her hands pressed up against her temples. What am I going to do? She groaned. You did use protection, didn't you? Demanded Sakura with probing eyes. These morning after pills aren't 100% effective. Oh yeah, mumbled Ino, still facing down at the wooden surface. Believe me, he used protection all right. Quite a few in fact. Blushing slightly at the rather uncomfortable topic, Sakura wasn't sure whether to comfort her friend or slap some sense into her. Ino who? Look, I don't want to have to tell the story more than once, grumbled Ino as she finally looked back up. We're still on for a Mikey's tonight at 9 with the girls, right? Nodding dumbly, Sakura could only watch through numb eyes as her friend walked out of the room, shoulders weighed down heavily by the events that were no doubt plaguing her. Suddenly her own fluctuating feelings on her teammate seemed like a small problem in comparison. A Mikey's was a popular hangout for young shinobi who weren't quite elite enough to get into the Junin and Anbu exclusive bars, but were skilled enough to be recognized as the next up-and-coming generation of ninja who would one day rise to protect their village. The atmosphere to the bar was warm if not a bit dark, but then people of their profession tended to like it darker than most. The soft ambient background music was just loud enough to be soothing, but not so loud that it was distracting. A simple noise to be tuned out by the patrons that frequented the popular watering hole, but it did its job of masking away conversations to make eavesdropping more difficult. There were dozens of tables that were scattered across the center of the relatively large room, strategically placed so that no one group had to feel completely exposed to another thanks to some handy wooden dividers. Lined up along the walls was the bar table with dozens upon dozens of stools for those who wished to drink away their misery alone, the racks furthest against the wall filled with rows upon rows of alcoholic beverages of all sorts from across the continent. The slow-moving ceiling fans often were not enough to help push the humidity caused by the large crowds of shinobi who frequented a Mikey's at night, but nobody seemed to particularly mind the slight discomfort. For those who did, the company of friends was enough to divert them from the small distraction. There was a stairwell that led up to a partial second floor. Where the center tiles should have been there were none, cut out so that the ground level was exposed. Along the walls of the second floor was a small walkway that heralded a dozen or so shinobi leaning up against the railings having a smoke and observing the crowd milling below. But of interest to most was the number of closed doors that led to the more private rooms clients could rent out should they feel a need for more solitude and could afford the expensive hourly fees in exchange for their privacy. Room 4C was one that was frequented by many shinobi, though perhaps none as often as its current inhabitants. Though their group was not as of yet complete, just having Tenten, Tamari and Hinata in the enclosed space was enough to produce a noise level most associated with an out-of-control party. The funny thing being that the alcohol had yet to be touched. Seriously, Hinata, jeered Tenten. You've been dating the poor boy for almost 2 years now, you really should put out and reward him for his efforts. The red-faced Hyuga heiress poked her forefingers together in a rapid beat, a habit she had yet to break when she was nervous or faced with a particularly distressing situation that didn't involve life-threatening circumstances. And not every relationship has to be about S10-chan, admonished the lavender-eyed girl. It had been a surprise to everyone when shy Hinata, who had a painfully obvious crush the size of the Hokage monument on their resident blonde knucklehead, had gone and agreed to go out with Choji of all people. More surprising was perhaps the fact that 2 years later the two were quite happily going steady to the approval of both their clans. Is that what he tells you? Teased the kunoichi hailing from Suna with a leer. Cause that's not what he's thinking with the way you look. Hinata gave a squeak of distress as she folded her arms across her rather ample chest. Out of all the girls of their group, Hinata had always had the distinct lead in body shape. Over the years that lead had just simply widened to the point where the desire of overtaking her had changed to hopes of simply getting anywhere near her. While the heiress tried desperately to hide her womanly shape behind baggy clothing and even resorted to wearing a parka in the middle of summer, there was just no hiding her definition. Or as Kiba often put it, Kami didn't grace her with such a figure to be hidden. Seriously, Hinata-chan, you should just let the poor boy have a taste. Maybe then he'll find an appetite for something other than food. Iha Avenue, let him ha Avenue a taste. Hinata shot back defiantly, her face color matching that of a tomato. Both the other occupants of the room sat up straighter at her nervous declaration, eyes alight with interest. Hinata was the only one out of all of them who had a steady boyfriend, yet she remained tight-lipped about anything the couple got up to. A rare opportunity to grill the girl had just unexpectedly presented itself. Oh yeah, when was this? How far did you two go? The two questions came together at the same time and Hinata seemed to wilt under the weight of their words. She opened her mouth to stutter out some defensive reply, but was interrupted with the slamming of the door. The occupants in the room all jumped and turned to stare at the heavily breathing pink-haired apprentice of the Godime Hokage. Her short hair was windswept and disheveled, as if she had been sprinting at high speeds. The light sheen of sweat only added to her appearance of having rushed to get here. Whoa, where's the fire?" demanded Tamari. Sakura was the more level-headed one in their group, and anything that had her sprinting Harif probably meant troubling news. "Where's Ino?" panted Sakura as she collapsed onto the space next to Hinata. "Did she get here yet?" Accepting an offered glass of water from Hinata gratefully, Sakura proceeded to chug it down in one go. Polishing off the water, she stuck the cup back out for another refill. "Ino?" asked Tenten, eyeing the pinkette curiously. "She hasn't gotten here yet. Did something happen?" "Yes," shrieked the only girl of Team 7, ignoring her refilled glass. "She came in requesting the morning after pill today." Hinata, who had been taking a sip of water from her own cup to calm her nerves after having narrowly escaped her own private interrogation session, sprayed the contents of her mouth out in shock. Tamari, having seated herself right across from the heiress, gave a shrieked curse of surprise at the unexpected shower. "What the hell? Wah, what? Ha, I knew it." The last triumphant cry came from Tenten, drawing odd stares from the other occupants in the room. The weapon mistress turned her Cheshire grin at her rival from Suna and thrust her palm out, face up. "What did I tell you, Tamari? Pay up, girl." The fan user groaned and slammed her head on the table with a dull wet thump where skull met wood. "God damn it, Ino," she moaned. What are you guys talking about?" demanded Sakura in confusion, her eyes darting between the two women. "We had a bet going," elaborated Tenten while making a V sign with her left hand. "Whether miss I'm going to stay a virgin until I marry my man will really be able to go through with it." The disciple of Guy prodded the still face-down Tamari using her free hand, a gleeful smile adorning her face. "Tamari here thought she could do it, I thought she couldn't. We put down an A-rank mission's worth of pay on the line to see who would be right. Guess who's suddenly a whole lot richer? That whore," growled Tamari as she reached into her purse to pull out the bills needed to honor her bet. "Do we know how him?" asked a curious Hinata, who had finally recovered from the unexpected news. "I don't know," moaned Sakura. "She wouldn't say. She'll tell us what happened tonight," she said. Tenten licked her finger and began to gleefully count away at the wad of bills Tamari had forked over, her eyes practically gleaming with greed and satisfaction. "Who cares who it was?" grumbled Tamari as she poured herself a saucer of the sake. Normally they waited until everyone was present to begin serving and drinking, but after having just lost about a month's worth of income because of Ino, Tamari wasn't feeling particularly charitable to her fellow blonde. "But guys, this was her first time," exclaimed Sakura with worry coloring her tone. She wasn't dating anyone, so it was probably with someone she didn't even really care all that much about. She must be devastated. "So she finally boinked a guy," snorted Tenten after pocketing the cash and helping herself to a saucer of alcohol as well. "It's nothing that special. If it really was her first time, it probably wasn't even all that fun, especially if the guy was a virgin too." "That's not the point," growled Sakura. "There is no point." Tenten shot back with a roll of her eyes. "Not everyone thinks is special like you rookie 9 girls. It's just an itch that needs scratching. And Ino finally got it scratched. Good for her." "Tenten," hissed Sakura, disapproval fierce in her eyes. "Come on, Haruno," grumbled Tamari as she served the remaining 2 girls. The kunoichi from Suna tended to revert to surnames when she was annoyed with people. "I'm the one who's from the prudish society that frowns on anything even remotely UAL in nature, and I'm telling you, it's not that big of a deal. It's not that simple," insisted Sakura with an angry shake of her head. The pink-haired girl glared around the table, but only saw defiance from the older girls and a desperate avoidance of eye contact from Hinata. She opened her mouth to reiterate the point that the psychological consequences for Ino might be much harder to brush off than for Tamari and Tenten, who had a much more casual approach to the act of copulation. But before the words could properly formulate and leave her mouth, the doorway slid open once more to reveal the rather disheveled-looking girl they had been discussing. The normally fashion-conscious Yamanaka was wearing clothing that was slightly rumpled-looking, hinting that perhaps she had not changed at all, and her hair while brushed did not have its usual glossy sheen. "Cheers to popping your cherry," toasted Tenten, getting an eye roll from Ino as she sealed the entryway. "Geez, tell the world, why don't you?" the Yamenka growled as she took a seat closest to the door. "And pour me a damn drink, will you?" Hinata carefully filled her friend's saucer of sake and handed it over to the blonde, who promptly knocked it back in one shot. "So who was it?" demanded Tenten eagerly with an impish glint in her eyes. "Anyone we know." "Tenten," shouted Sakura with a glare. "That's enough. Ino, don't listen to her, you don't need to tell us anything. We're here for you." The blonde in question mumbled something under her breath and waggled her empty saucer at Hinata. There was a slightly distant look in her eyes that made the girl share a glance of worry. "Hey Ino," said the weapons mistress carefully, "it was consented, right?" Both Hinata and Sakura gasped as they looked at their friend in horror, and even Tamari had pulled herself out of her funk over losing money enough to cast a concerned gaze at the younger blonde. "Yeah," Ino said after a lengthy pause. "We were both drunk out of our minds, but yeah, it was consented on my part." The tension left the room somewhat, though not entirely, given the mood Ino was still in. "So what's wrong, Ino?" asked Tamari. "He bad in bed or something?" The other girls all watched with interest as Ino blushed profusely and stuttered out something that couldn't be understood. After a few moments, the Yamanaka gave up and snatched the bottle of sake from Hinata to give herself a refill, avoiding looking anyone in the eye. "Well," drawled Tenten with a grin, "that answers that. So what's cutting you up, Blondie?" Again Ino mumbled something incoherent, and the other girls exchanged confused looks. "Come again," said Sakura. "I said he wants to try for a real relationship," grounded out Ino with a heavy glare at her sake saucer as if the poor cup was the source of all her frustrations. "Oh, that's a good teeing, right?" asked Hinata hopefully. Given Ino's sour expression, it obviously was not, but someone had to be the optimist, and Hinata was the least likely to get slapped down for it. "Yes. No. I don't know," groaned Ino, burying her face in her arms. "That's what's got me so confused. I mean, I know the guy, but I've never really thought of him that way before. He's a sweet guy, but just never to me. I don't know. I don't like him, but I could like him. And he seems to like me. Maybe I want to like him. Or maybe that's the great talking. I don't know. This is all his fault. Arrgh. It seems once she started talking, Ino broke down into an incoherent mess of words that gave away all her inner turmoil. It was a good thing they had rented out their own room. Having Ino scream and pull at her own hair probably would have gotten them thrown out eventually. The only questions would have been whether the Anbu with the straitjacket would come before or after they were booted out of the building. "Wait, so if you know him, does that mean we know him?" asked Tamari slowly. "Is it Shika?" cut in Tenten eagerly. That question earned her a glare and a kick under the table from a scowling Tamari. The Sand Kunoichi's budding relationship with the shadow user was best described as lukewarm, though that didn't stop the blonde from being aggressive towards any woman showing an interest in the younger man. "What?" asked Ino with a look of slight disgust. "You know, Shika's like a brother to me. We grew up together." "Yeah, so?" asked Tenten. "Not all of us are open to the thought of sleeping with our teammates," grounded out Sakura with a frosty glare at the bun-haired girl. It was common knowledge that Team 9 was closer than most. Close as in the three members had decided that shared bedroom activity was a good team-building exercise. No one wanted to know more beyond that. In fact, probably even that little tidbit should be considered TMI. Tenten shrugged dismissively. "Well, you don't know what you're missing out on." "So who is it?" probed Hinata gently. "Naruto." There was a collective pause as the room fell into stunned silence. In the momentary stillness, the single ceiling fan in the room buffeting air with its dull wooden blades seemed unnaturally loud. "What?" The collective echoing cry was loud enough that even the outside noise seemed to pause for a moment. No doubt the people downstairs had been distracted by the synchronized screech from room 4C, the supposedly soundproof room. Tenten was practically rolling on the floor with hysterical laughter, tears leaking down the side of her face while she pointed a finger at Ino while gasping out random words or phrases that really wasn't intelligible in any way. Tamari had both her eyebrows up so far towards her hairline she resembled her youngest brother's features as she glanced pensively at her fellow blonde, but most surprising was Hinata, who didn't seem too upset about the discovery that her friend had slept with her former crush. The pink-haired girl of the group had fallen silent, her eyes unmoving as she stared down at the table, soft words breaking past her lips that was too low for the rest to be heard. I know, moaned Ino. Look, don't touch, but damn if I didn't touch. Downing another saucer of the belly-warming liquid, Ino turned an apologetic look to Hinata. I'm so sorry, Hinata. I swear to Kami I had no idea what I was doing at the time. Can you ever forgive me? The voluptuous heiress simply gave her friend a sad smile of reassurance. It's all right, Ino-chan. I've gotten over the fact court that Naruto-kun and I will never be anything more than friends. I have Choji now. Tenten finally managed to regain her seat at the table and had wiped the last of the tears that had streamed down her face. So tell me, Ino-chan, how big was he? Oh my god, Tenten, shrieked Sakura even as Ino flushed a deeper red. I do not need to hear this. Tamari chuckled at the flustered blonde from Konoha. He really is hung like a horse, isn't he? Whoa, wait, hold up, shouted Tenten as she made a crossed X shape with her arms. And how in the hell would you know about the horse-like quality of Naruto's? Tamari gave a nonchalant shrug as she took another sip of her saucer. Naruto and I had a brief fling when he and Jiraiya swung by Suna. Wait, what? Shouted Sakura and Ino together in stereo. A fling? Demanded Tenten. When the hell was this and how long did you two go out for? Hell, why did you two even go out for? I didn't even know you had an interest in him. I was the former Cage's daughter, and the current one's sister. You know, the guy who just a few years back were regarded as a homicidal maniac who murdered people on a whim. That kinda relation isn't exactly stellar for a girl's love life. Naruto's the only one who didn't give two craps about my background and about the only guy who would stand up to Gaara when it came down to it. Hell yeah, I jumped him. You're lying, accused Tenten, yanking our chain. There is no way in hell you and Naruto had gotten together. I refuse to believe that. The Suna noble gave a uncaring shrug. Believe what you will. Though tell me, Ino, does this look familiar? Tamari pulled up the end of her tight black figure-hugging shorts, peeling the clingy material until her creamy thigh was exposed to the air. On the inside, half an inch away from the delicate folds of her maidenhood, was a small unobtrusive tattoo of a raccoon, stylized in a cartoonish fashion. Ino dropped her head back into her arms with a groan after staring in disbelief. What the hell does she mean, Ino? Demanded Tenten. Naruto's got a matching one on his thigh, mumbled the face-down blonde. Does Gaara know? Demanded Sakura. Tamari smirked. He found out eventually. Last I checked, Naruto and Gaara are still practically best friends, said Tenten slowly. The kunoichi from Suna laughed. Well, Gaara approved. I think he was severely disappointed when it turned out neither of us had a long-term relationship in mind. Don't think he would have minded having Naruto as a brother-in-law. Here the older kunoichi broke out into a wistful sigh as she conjured up an image of the current Naruto in her mind's eye. Maybe I was being a bit short-sighted. Tenten finally shook off her disbelief with a throaty chuckle. Well, seems little Naru-chan's quite the man. With two endorsements like that, I wouldn't mind taking him out for a ride. Too bad it seems he has a thing for blondes. Looks like we never stood a chance, Hinata. Hinata, who had remained mostly quiet so far, turned and glared at her friend rebelliously. He's not just into blondes. It took a moment for what the shy girl in their group had mumbled to fully sink in. No, stuttered Sakura as both blondes in the group gaped at their pale-eyed friend. No, just no. No friggin' way. When? What the hell is this? Complained Tenten with a scowl. I thought I was supposed to be the in the group. You know, slept with both my teammates. Hinata, cried a disbelieving Ino, you're been with Choji for 2 years. It was the night before he left, mumbled the raven-haired Hyuga, reverting back into her more shy mode as her courage failed her again. I went to confess to him my feelings fearing I would lose him forever otherwise. And he took advantage of you? Demanded Sakura angrily. In her mind she was already preparing to pound her teammate's face in. Best friend or not, she wasn't going to let him getting away with coercing Hinata into giving away her virginity like that. No, replied Hinata with a faraway look. He told me he had always kn no own. But we so old never be together cause of what he was. Wait, said Ino slowly, so you knew all the way back then that he held the Kyubi. The shy heiress nodded an affirmative. I understood od finally he never gave me any hope. Okay, that's nice and all with all the touchy-feely crap, interrupted Tenten impatiently. But how exactly did this lead to you two making the beast with two backs? Again the next in line for the leadership of the Hyuga clan flushed a deep red, turning her gaze to avoid eye contact with her friends. I told I am, that if I couldn't avenue him for my Li Ife, then I wo old at least Li Ike to have him for one night. And of course being the nice guy he is, grumbled Ino with a sarcastic scowl, he agreed. Is that why you won't let Choji go all the way? Don't want to be disappointed? Asked a curious Tamari. Cause I know from personal experience that Naruto sets the bar pretty damn high. Okay, who has not slept with Naruto here? Raise your hand, demanded Tenten. Am I the only one? Sakura, have you slept with him too? No, I just, what the hell? Shouted the pinkett, face aghast with emotions. Okay, now that we've established the fact that Naruto is in fact a man, ground out Ino, that really still doesn't help me answer my question. Now hold up, that's rather unfair, defended Tenten. All we've established is that he's slept with you Tamari and Hinata, all on separate occasions in a 3-year interval. That hardly qualifies him to be a man. Those 3 are the only ones that we know of, muttered Sakura darkly, who knows how many girls he met during his training trip. Again, not helping, grumbled Ino with a glower at the thought. Seriously though, what the hell should I do? I think you should give him a chance, said Tamari with a shrug. He really is a sweet guy, loyal to a fault. A bit clueless, but A for effort where it counts. Let me know if you don't want him Ino, said Tenten with mischievous glint in her eyes. Cause now you've got me all curious. If you're not riding that bronco I'm gonna give a shot at him. Winking at Sakura, Tenten's smile turned evil. Come on Sakura, 3 out of 5 of us have taken him for a ride. What say we make a group experience we can all share about? You and me can go give Ino's boy toy a night he won't forget. Ino glared back at her dark-haired friend raising her left hand in a silent one-finger salute as a reply, getting a bark of laugh from Tenten even as Sakura shot daggers back with her eyes. I think that Temari's right, said Hinata, adding her own 2 cents on the matter. What do you think Sakura? Asked Ino. You've known him the longest. Sakura toyed with her own untouched saucer of sake, staring down into her own reflection in the liquor. A profound sense of sadness radiated from the green eyes that looked back out from the liquid. It was odd really. Back when Naruto had pestered her for a date on a daily basis she had practically dreamed of a day like this when he would finally get a girlfriend and leave her all alone with Sasuke. Though she had come to think of her blonde teammate as a friend by then, she had nonetheless imagined it as one of the happiest days of her life. Now that the day was here, Sasuke was the furthest thing from her mind. A tight feeling of jealousy burned in her chest at the thought of Ino being with Naruto, stronger than any feeling she had during the days of rivalry with the blonde over the Uchiha. Sasuke had been a thing to have, the newest latest fashionable handbag a girl could drag about to watch the envy ooze from the eyes of other girls. Losing Naruto was a blow straight to the gut that made her want to heave bile. When had Naruto's dating life suddenly mattered so much to her? Sakura, prompted Ino warily, seeing the stormy expression on her longtime friend's face. I don't know, the Mednin mumbled at last. I really don't. I guess it wouldn't hurt to give it a shot, muttered Ino after a long moment. Besides, it's not like I'm in love with the guy. We'd just go out on a few dates, get to know each other a bit more. I bet we're not even all that compatible and it'll fizzle out after a while. Tenten rolled her eyes as she poured the last of the sake. Hello, horse. The Yamanaka flushed and threw her empty saucer at the weapon specialist, who easily dodged with a laugh. Somehow that small action broke the tension that had been hanging over the group like an unpleasant fog, and the festive air that was more common to their get-togethers came back in full force. Though they laughed and drank away merrily enough, a certain pink-haired kunoichi couldn't quite put all her heart behind the drunken toasts for long years of happiness between the new blonde couple. There surely would be the sounds of many breaking hearts in the village once it became official, though the tinkle and cracking of one in particular could already be heard. Ino stretched her hands lazily above her head, lacing her manicured fingers together as she worked at the kink on her back. Fighting desperately not to give in to the yawn threatening to escape her mouth, she blinked back tears from the effort it took to contain the often unstoppable biological phenomenon. Giving in to mental fatigue, Ino allowed her head to drop dully onto her desk with enough force to cause her to wince. Catching sight of the pink rubbery eraser ending of her pencil in her periphery, Ino s out her tongue to draw in the offending stationery into mouth. Absent-mindedly chewing on the eraser, she sent the pencil tip waggling through the air in wild figure eight. After the amusement at her own actions had worn off, the tired teenager allowed her exhausted mind to wander. Working in the IT department was supposed to be interesting and a stimulating challenge for her intellect. When there was an active time-sensitive case going on, that was true, but when there wasn't, she really didn't care that there had been a 0.4% increase in the food requisition orders from Mizu, and she sure as hell didn't care to write a 30-page report speculating on why that might be the case. It wasn't like anyone was going to actually read it, the Hokage clearly didn't. And the monotony wasn't just limited to the paperwork, even their uniforms reflected the dreariness of their department. Why gray? It countered everything fashionable, and putting that aside, the drab color simply weighed on the mind like concrete anchors. Not exactly the type of stimulant you wanted in a workplace that emphasized having an agile mind to analyze data and intelligence reports. A brief glance around showed her fellow floor staff was hardly faring any better. She was seated on one of 20 desks placed in a 5-row by 4-column formation where the majority of the intelligence officers sat to sift through the tons of information gathered by shinobi out in the field. The cookie-cutter workstations were made of solid metal, complete with squeaky drawers on both sides for endless files full of aged papers that hardly ever saw light. The solid mahogany finish for the top of the desks was a nice touch though, a pigment of color in an otherwise dull black and white snapshot of the intelligence and torture department. The IT employees were trapped in an underground facility, a strategic decision made mainly to demoralize prisoners who never got to see anything but the 4 walls of their cell and the hallways leading to their interrogation cells. But what the designers hadn't kept in mind was how the environment would affect the people working there. While they did get to go home after work, unlike the detainees, the majority of their day was still spent facing those same depressing architecture. Not exactly motivation for work productivity. While there were no windows to gaze out of, that certainly didn't stop people from zoning off. It was early afternoon, slightly after the lunch hour. One of those warm hazy days that made you want to curl up under the shade of a tree in a park with a good book or perhaps watch the clouds roll by. Most of the staff was still recovering from slight food comas, so it wasn't surprising to see vacant stares aimed at anything but the paperwork. Noticing how a few of her male coworkers had been sneakily sending her glances, Ino frowned and hastily put her arms back down. Being an attractive young woman, Ino was rather partial to being complimented for her beauty through wordless admiration, but that didn't mean she wanted to be ogled like a piece of meat at every turn. There was appreciation for beauty and ogling. She didn't mind the first, but the latter made her hackles rise and her stomach revolt. Idly tapping her pencil against the tabletop, she allowed her mind to continue roaming away from her current assigned task. And as it so often did these past few days, the first thing that came to mind was a certain blonde goofball she had ended up in bed with the weekend prior. It had been an odd week for Ino since she had decided to give Naruto a chance, mainly because she hadn't seen the boys since the morning after they had roused from their night of X-rated activities. Waking up to an epic hangover from her outing with the girls the night before, Ino had cleaned herself up and marched on over to Naruto's house to tell him that she'd be willing to let him take her on one date. Just one. When she didn't receive an answer after knocking for a few minutes, she had assumed that he had already left his home. Wandering through the few locations he hung out at that she knew of, namely Team 7's training field, Ichiraku Ramen stand and the Hokage's tower, she had seen neither hide nor hair of the Jinchuriki. More than a little miffed at his sudden vanishing act, Ino had stormed off to find Sakura to see if she knew where her teammate was. An annoyed and harassed-looking Sakura had informed her that the blonde in question had apparently been appropriated for an A-class mission the night before. Something about infiltrating one of the minor shinobi villages in order to retrieve a man Konoha wanted to ask some very pointed questions towards. The disappointment that pooled in the bottom of her stomach was brushed aside hurriedly as she did not want to examine her own feelings on the matter too closely. Instead, Ino had told herself that it was probably a good thing that she wouldn't be seeing him for a while. Time and space would give her a better perspective on what was going on between them. It hadn't exactly worked out like she hoped given her mind's penitence for fixating on the nine-tailed demon's host. A pair of warm hands clapped themselves over Ino's eyes, startling her out of her sleepy funk. It took a monumental effort to suppress the instinctive response to smash the back of her head against her assailant's nose to disorient them. But she was in friendly territory, so the chances that someone was trying to kill her was pretty low, and binding the eyes would hardly be the first choice for most assassins. If that someone was trying to kill her, the fact that she hadn't sensed anything up until that moment meant they could have left her dead without her even realizing it. Plus the warm rough-skinned palms were tantalizingly familiar. Guess who, Ino-chan? The low throaty rumble was akin to a large predatory feline's purr. Coupled with the warm breath tickling her ear, the spine-tingling combination sent her pulse racing. A pleasant shudder threatened to escape, making the poor Yamanaka want to squirm in her seat, but she wouldn't allow him to have the satisfaction of getting to her. Let me think about that, she pondered aloud with a sly grin that she knew he couldn't see. Does it happen to be a blonde loudmouth who has a hideous fetish for orange? Oi, it's not a fetish. And orange is awesome, the faceless voice of her captivation protested. The hands left her eyes and instead dropped down to her shoulders, where they began a sensual rhythmic kneading motion that drew a soft moan from the seated young woman. Leaning back in her chair, Ino closed her eyes and allowed her fellow blonde's skillful hands to quickly work away at the kink she had been desperately trying to get rid of. Waves of pleasure rolled through her as her body crooned its approval. Oh, yeah, right there. Her instructional groans devolved into meaningless sounds of satisfaction as Naruto continued working away at all her sore spots with the attention of a master masseuse. Real kinky, you too. If I closed my eyes, I can almost imagine my bedroom a couple of nights ago, cut in a sultry voice, interrupting Ino's blissful moment of distraction. Dark lavender eyes popped open and Ino felt herself flush slightly when she noticed how quite a few of her colleagues were red around the cheeks and desperately trying to avoid looking at the two intimately positioned teenagers. Glaring slightly at the purple-haired woman who was smirking at her, Ino stuck out her tongue childishly at her superior. Real mature response there, Yamanaka, snorted Mitarashi Anko. The snake mistress hadn't changed much since they first met her as Genin. She still sported the tan trench coat along with the semi-transparent fishnet underclothing that left nothing to the imagination. The shadowed form of her nipples was just teasingly out of view, giving the impression of erect buds when the light struck her at the right angle. The only notable difference was that Anko had allowed her hair grow out to shoulder length, something that started back when she first started sleeping regularly with Kakashi. The one-time apprentice of the Snake Sanin was a sabotage and assassination specialist, but when she wasn't off killing someone or slipping mercury into a well somewhere, she hung out in the IT department. Of course, she was much too temperamental to be given paperwork, so she spent most her time either intimidating the prisoners for fun or helping Ibiki pour boiling tar on some poor inmate's chest. She didn't have any official rank within the intelligence department as she had never sat through the exams, but she was widely accepted as the unofficial second in command in interrogation. The physical aspects of it at any rate. "You're just jealous Kakashi would never give you a massage," shot back and amused Naruto as he continued the circular motions of his thumb on Ino's trapezius. The Mind Walker couldn't help but marvel at the ripples of relaxation that was coursing through her being from that one simple motion. "He massages me in other places," sang Anko with a knowing gleam in her eyes. "I can teach you if you want, Naruto-chan." Naruto shivered slightly as he crossed his arms protectively over Ino's chest in a slight hug, careful to keep his hands away from anything inappropriate. "Yeah, let's not even go there. It's just wrong in so many ways." "Why?" asked a genuinely surprised Anko. "I'm sure Kakashi would be open to that sort of thing." "Yeah, well, I'm not," grumbled back the blonde male with another comical shudder. "Though I have to ask, does he keep his mask on when you two?" Anko threw her head back and laughed. "Only one way you'll ever find out, little man." Naruto raised his hands in a warding motion. "Yeah, not that interested. You get that guy we nabbed all squared away yet?" "Sure did, Uzumaki. Nice working with you again. If you ever get tired of Blondie here and decide to satisfy your curiosity on how a real woman's like in bed, you know where to find me." Shooting Naruto a sly wink, the purple-haired Kunoichi turned and sashayed away towards the interrogation facilities with a disturbing expression and an odd bounce in her step. "She's all right once you get to know her," Naruto parroted with raised eyebrows. "She's a nutcake." "She is not," laughed Ino. "She just acts that way 'cause she likes to see people's reaction. It's all a tactic." "Right," said Naruto doubtfully as he rubbed at his chin. "I guess this is a case of living a lie for so long it becomes the truth." Ignoring her friend's musing, Ino prodded him with her foot. "So where have you been? You've been gone all week." "Ah, Ino-chan, did you miss me?" teased the orange-clad male as he wrapped her up in another hug. "Yeah, like a yeast infection," shot back Ino while wiggling out of his grip. The loss of warm bodily contact when she finally escaped filled her with a rather surprising amount of regret. Did a snatch and grab of an informant that decided he didn't want to talk anymore out in some new upstart village, grunted Naruto as he leaned up against her desk with his palms resting on the edge of the tabletop. "Seems after Sound managed to make it big, everyone and their mother thinks they can set up a hidden village. Hell, I probably could have wiped them off the map by myself." Laughing at the annoyed expression on her classmate's face, Ino poked a finger against his stomach, marveling internally at how hard it was. "Someone did their sit-ups." "Yeah, well, we don't all have an endless source of chakra stuck in our stomach now, do we?" she asked rhetorically. Scoffing, the container for the Kyuubi turned Ino around in her wheelie chair and went right back to work on her shoulders, much to her approval. "So Ino," began Naruto with a tentative look on his face, "you've given what we talked about more thought." The Yamanaka heir hummed lowly while smirking devilishly at her fellow blonde's apprehension. She really should make him suffer after running off on her after she had finally made up her mind and causing her to wait. But she was a nice person. Plus that massage at the moment made up for everything. "Well," she drawled imperiously, "I've decided that because I don't have much else going on that I'll give you a chance to blow your money on me. I mean, who in their right mind wouldn't want to? One day you can tell your grandkids you managed to get a date with the Ino Yamanaka once upon a time." Naruto tossed his head back and gave a rich throaty laugh, earning him more than one dreamy looks from the women seated behind Ino. "Well, aren't you generous, Ino? How about tonight? You got any plans? Startled slightly at the quick response, Ino grabbed the end of her ponytail and fiddled with the tips of her long hair. The butterflies had returned, turning her stomach into a lottery raffle cage filled with bouncy balls. She hadn't quite expected being asked out so soon, and in front of her coworkers no less. Glancing up, she didn't see a hint of mortification on her fellow blonde's face after having so openly propositioning her in front of an audience. Tonight. Well, yeah, I'm not doing anything else after work, I suppose, she said cautiously. Great. When do you get off? At 6, but I'm not going out dressed like this. Ino protested while gesturing down at the drab gray uniform that had zero appeal. Wouldn't dream of it, though I can't think of anything you wouldn't look good in, Ino-chan. The offhand compliment caused heat to flood her cheeks and the girl silently cursed her body. What the hell was wrong with her? Was she coming down with a fever? If only she could sink into the floor at will. There was probably a jutsu for that. Why don't I come pick you up at 7 o'clock? That should give you some time to freshen up and change. You want to risk running into daddy? Asked Ino with raised eyebrows. Most boys who had asked her out steered as far away from her home as possible, opting to meet her out at an agreed-upon location rather than risk coming within 100 meters of her mind-reading father. Well, there's only one thing I need to hide, chuckled Naruto with a wink. Ino burned crimson at the blatant reminder of what had taken place between them. That was definitely something she didn't want her father to accidentally stumble upon. She wouldn't be surprised if the man decided to do a brief cursory scan of any boy that walked within a meter of her to make sure they had pure intentions, let alone one she brought home. Good thing daddy doesn't have any heart issues, she thought. She may have been known as the village gossip, but she certainly hadn't learned that habit from her mother, a rather quiet and reserved woman. No, there was no doubt that her father was very much aware of Naruto's recently elevated status from village pariah to low-town bad boy. The question was how close the poor boy could get to the Yamanaka household before killing intent began pouring out of the house. Plus, I think it'd be scarier for you guys than me if you decided to go for a stroll in my mind. Naruto jabbed a thumb at his navel and Ino nodded in understanding after a moment. Yeah. Anyone who tried to infiltrate Naruto's mind would probably find themselves worrying about something much nastier than having to dig through some buried memories. Some people had natural mental defenses. Naruto had a soul-eating demon guarding his mind. If anyone could survive meeting her overprotective mind-reading father with their sanity intact, it would probably be Naruto. So 7 o'clock? He asked hopefully. Ino bit her lip as she imagined her parents meeting Naruto. Not that he was a bad guy or anything. It was just that she had never brought a boy home before. She had a fair idea on how her father might act. And her mother, the woman, would probably be shooting Ino silently insufferable knowing looks for weeks after meeting Naruto. Well, nothing ventured, nothing gained, right? Plus it was one date. And it might be fun to watch her father make Naruto squirm a little. That would be her vengeance towards him for deflowering her while she had been hammered. Yeah, sure, that sounds good, she replied with a wicked smirk. What will we be doing? Tutted Naruto, wagging a finger in her face. That would be telling. Oh, come on, she whined, how am I supposed to know what to wear? Didn't I tell you? Replied Naruto softly as he took up one of her hands in his. You'd look good in anything. Coloring at his compliment, Ino pouted as he gave her knuckles a brief brush against his rough lips before getting up to leave. Seriously, Naruto, what should I wear? She shouted at his retreating back. Laughing and waving goodbye without turning, he yelled back. Something nice. We should probably look the part where we're going. Watching her fellow blonde vanish around the corner, the Yamanaka folded her arms across her generously developed chest and grumbled about bakas in orange. Something nice, he says. HMMPH, does he even have anything that qualifies? She grumbled uncharitably. Turning back, she noticed several jealous looks she was receiving from the other kunoichi and one of the shinobi seated at their desks. Rolling her eyes, She turned back to the pile of paperwork that seemed to have grown in size while she had been preoccupied with Naruto. Getting back to it, she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. Somehow the dreary work suddenly didn't seem so bad now that she had plans for the evening. Mio Yamanaka stood at the entrance to her daughter's room, watching on in bemusement as her only offspring hovering before the bed in her undergarments. While her daughter was rather well acquainted with the latest fashion trends that seemed to take off in a different direction every other season or so, the girl was rarely seen spending much time being indecisive on what to actually wear. It wasn't just pride as a mother speaking when Mio said that her daughter looked good in just about anything. Ino was giving herself a hard stare in front of the full-length mirror situated in the room, frowning at the slightly haggard appearance of her reflection. Spending all day underground was not good for her complexion. Black or blue? The younger girl directed the question at her mother, who was still observing her daughter amusedly from the shadow of the doorway. Well, that depends, Ino-chan. Are you going out with a friend tonight or trying to bring a man home? Chuckling at scandalized expression reflected in the mirror, the older Yamanaka stepped up behind her daughter to peer at the two outfits that was the source of conflict. One was a stylish floor-sweeping open-backed evening gown that was a brilliant sapphire. The delicate fabric was dotted with sparkling gems at the chest, showing off just enough cleavage to entice, but not so much as to scream for attention. The blue material seemed to thin out in layers as it went down the body until it was practically transparent at the legs, allowing a bit of skin to show behind the translucent cloth. The fine silky garment would not have looked out of place in the court of the feudal lord. The second choice was a body-hugging black cut that accentuated every tantalizing womanly curve. The soft silk-like material managed to hide everything and nothing at the same time. The elastic fabric allowed for not a single scrap of cloth to hang, as it would mold tightly to the contour of the wearer. It was the perfect illustration of the phrase, "little black dress," and left nothing to the imagination. The stylish black dress was cut off right before the knees, showing plenty of leg, but falling just short of being appalling. The designer managed to skillfully turn up the Innis factor on the chic threads without abusing the skin card. Without a doubt the dress would turn heads and send tongues wagging wherever its owner walked. The matriarch pursed her lips as she considered the two exquisite examples of her daughter's fine taste in fashion, marveling at how quickly her Ino-chan had grown up. On one hand, she wanted her daughter to be safe and not send off the wrong signal to the boy that was taking her out tonight. But at the same time, Mio herself was a woman and understood all too well her young daughter's desire to flaunt her feminine qualities in order to attract the attention of a man. The internal struggle between mother and woman swirled like a storm, but after a long pause Mio came to her decision. "You said he's coming to pick you up tonight?" The older woman asked her daughter curiously. Ino was no stranger to dating, but she had never brought a boy over to their house before. No doubt her husband's fearsome reputation as a mind reader working in IT, well known for their liberal dispensing of torture, had something to do with that. "Yeah, he said he'd be coming by around 7 o'clock. Ino glanced at her clock and bit her lip nervously when she saw that it was 5 minutes away from the appointed time. Mio pulled up the dark dress and gave it an appraising once-over. "Well, I think if the boy is brave enough to come face your father, then he deserves a little something special, Ino stared pensively at the dark dress, weighing the pros and cons of donning the more provocative outfit. On one hand, she would look extremely nice and more than likely blow poor Naruto's mind out of the water. His reaction alone would be worth it, but was that what she wanted to do? She had bought that dress because it had looked stunning on her. However, Ino had never had a chance to wear it before, since she had never wanted to gain the kind of attention that dress would bring. This wasn't just a tail party dress, it was an open invitation to try to take me home so you can remove it kind of dress. Well, no point in buying it if I was never going to wear it, she thought sheepishly. Taking the midnight-hued dress from her mother, she quickly slipped into the material, reveling in the gentle caress of the wispy silken fabric against her skin. The cool glossy material raised goosebumps where textile touched skin, but she looked undeniably striking, the dark contrast bringing out her hair and eyes. As she pulled on the black 4-inch stilettos bought specifically for the outfit, her mother walked up behind her and began to carefully coil her long blonde hair up. Straightening, the younger Yamanaka watched her mother work away at her hair in the mirror, skillfully weaving the long strands into a beautiful work of art complete with a pair of silver chopsticks engraved with miniature dragon carvings. It had been years since her mother had helped her put her hair up. Once Ino had been accepted into the ninja academy, she had insisted that she was old enough to take care of her own grooming, and her mother had accepted that without a fuss. The blonde girl hadn't realized how much she missed this bonding moment until she was sitting there under her mother's tender ministrations again. "So tell me about this boy. What is he like?" "He's an idiot," Ino blurted out immediately before she could even really think about it. Her mother laughed at her response, casting a critical eye at her daughter's reflection before making micro-adjustments here and there. "All men are idiots, Ino-chan," she responded absent-mindedly. "What's his name?" "Naruto. Uzumaki Naruto." Ino didn't miss the momentary pause in her mother's hands, but the older woman continued on without comment, leaving Ino to stew in her own thoughts. "Like I said, he's an idiot, an attention-seeking loudmouth who was dead last in our graduating year." Ino paused as she reflected on what she knew about him. "I guess that's who he was anyways. A couple of years ago he left with Jiraiya-sama and trained with him for 3 years. He came back a year ago, but he's different now, more reserved and thoughtful." "Sounds like he grew up," commented the older woman thoughtfully as she turned to eye her daughter's makeup kit. "I guess. It's weird though. He used to be all dead set on Sakura, but out of the blue he decides to ask me out," said Ino with a frown. Well, maybe not entirely out of the blue given what had taken place the night before he had expressed his interest in her. Ino still didn't know how to feel about the 180 her fellow blonde had done. He had been gone for the better part of 3 years, and since his return no one had seen him pester Sakura for a date. But given the amount of time those two spent together, people had simply assumed they had quietly gotten together and wasn't too keen on letting others know about it. It wasn't so uncommon in their field of work. Loved ones were a weakness that could be used against a shinobi. "Sakura-chan?" inquired Mio in surprise. "My, you two seem to always cross paths in your love interests." The young mink walker felt her face flush slightly at her mother's observation. "He's not a love interest. We're just going out 'cause I didn't have any other plans." After a night of fantastic, she added silently with an internal wince. "Oh, is that why you were agonizing over what to wear?" teased the clan matriarch. "Because the last few times you went out with a boy you just threw on the first thing you grabbed from the closet, if I remember right." Ino looked away, embarrassed that her mother had noticed. It was true that she had probably spent more time worrying about her appearance for this one night than all the other ones she'd been on combined. For her prior dates she had the unshakable belief that she would look good in anything she put on. Hell, they should be thankful for her presence, let alone judge her for her appearance. But for tonight Ino didn't want to just look good, she wanted to look fantastic. Why that was the case she was still puzzling through in her head. Mother and daughter fell silent as Mio carefully applied a minimal amount of makeup to Ino's face. The blonde girl had never particularly cared for using makeup, but she kept some in her room for those rare occasions where she did need a brief touch-up in appearance. Those occasions were rare and far between. A light touch of foundation, followed by some eyeliner and a light application of lip gloss was all that was needed. "Perfect. I don't think that poor boy will be able to keep his eyes off you tonight, Ino-chan," said Mio in a self-satisfied manner. Turning to examine her reflection, Ino couldn't disagree. She looked damn hot if she had to say so herself. Picking up the black purse where she kept some money and identification, Ino twirled once in front of the mirror to make sure nothing was out of place. Nodding in satisfaction, the kunoichi proceeded to slip a few blades into areas where they would not be too noticeable. Not that she was afraid that Naruto was going to try anything that would require her to defend herself, but it was just good practice to always be armed. Smiling at her mother's approving look, She drew a breath and prepared to head downstairs where no doubt her father was busy burning a hole into Naruto's head for daring to even set foot into the house, let alone take out his little princess. Her mother's hand on her shoulder stopped her descent and she turned a curious look to the woman's rather serious face. Ino-chan, do you have some condoms in your purse? The blonde bombshell felt her jaw drop as she stared back at her mother in disbelief, uncertain if she had heard correctly. What? Why would I need that? Ino spluttered with heat blossoming on her cheeks. I've seen that boy, laughed Mio with sly knowing gleam in her eyes. A strapping young lad like that isn't in demand for his ability to spout poetry. You're a grown woman who can make her own decisions, regardless of what your father might believe. If you do decide to stay for the night with Naruto-kun, I want you to be safe. Now if you don't have any protection, I'll go get some from my room. Ew mom, I did not need to know that, yelled Ino, the volume of her voice fueled by mortification. And that is not happening between me and Naruto. Again, she amended guiltily. Her mother raised both hands up in an appeasing manner to calm her daughter. Well, you're a smart girl, Ino-chan, I just want you to be happy. Though take some advice from your mother, I would make my decision on whether you like him or not quickly. A man like that won't be on the market for long. Attraction is a funny thing. When you have it you might not care for it, but when you lose it you suddenly crave it. Sakura-chan might change her mind about Naruto-kun if you remain indecisive for too long. Ignoring the way her heart had plummeted into her stomach at the mention of Sakura, Ino rolled her eyes at her mother. Hell, if Sakura wants to take this headache out of my hands I'd gift wrap him with a bow tie for her, she grumbled half-heartedly. Shaking her head with an amused smile, the older woman shook her head and ushered her daughter towards the stairwell to their two-storied home. Whatever you say, Ino-chan, let's go meet that man of yours before your father figures out where he wants to hide the body. The two women descended into the living room expecting to find a frigid atmosphere with a glaring Inoichi and cowering Naruto set apart as far as physically possible. Instead, what they found was the two men conversing inaudibly about something in the kitchen area, two bottles of beer opened before them. Naruto was saying something while repeatedly making a triangle figure with his hands for some unknown reason as Inoichi looked on intently with an intrigued expression on his face. The two women shared a stupefied look as the Yamanaka clan head burst out into rueful laughter while shaking his head. Clapping his hand onto the younger man's shoulder, Inoichi leaned forward, making a circular motion with his finger while replying back, causing Naruto to crack up as well. Mio steered her befuddled daughter over to the two oblivious men, clearing her throat to get their attention. Inoichi turned and his mouth fell open when he set eyes on his daughter, having rarely seen her dress up for anything. Ino, however, only had eyes for her date for the night. She was pleased to note that Naruto had a stunned expression on his face, as if someone had told him that Ichiraku's ramen was closing down for good. Oh yeah, she thought with an internal fist pump, so worth it. After a moment of muteness, Naruto finally seemed to have found his tongue again. His face morphed into a calm smile before stretching into that irresistible grin of his which set off a similar one on Ino's face as well. Wow, he breathed, eyes lit up. Ino-chan, you look gorgeous. Blushing self-consciously at the blatant honesty in his voice, Ino averted her eyes in embarrassment. She was in for a surprise when he reached behind the counter and pulled up a batch of a dozen white roses with a single red one centered in the beautiful formation. The dark ruby stood out like a beacon against the field of gentle white surrounding it, accentuating the beauty of the single red rose in the skillfully fashioned bouquet. Gasping in delight, Ino took the flowers from him and gave them a brief sniff before handing them over to her mother, who had already retrieved a vase. The analogy he was trying to draw with his offering was not lost on her. It hadn't escaped her mother either from the pleased expression seen on her face. Ino felt herself melt a little on the inside at the wordless compliment he had just handed her. Sometimes the best compliments were the unspoken ones. You didn't buy that from a competitor, did you? She joked even as her happy smile refused to die down. Naruto chuckled and scratched at the back of his head. There's no good answer to that, so I'm going to keep quiet. Smart move, she laughed. Thanks for the roses. Breaking out of her own internal delight to take in his appearance, Ino couldn't help but marvel at how neatly her fellow blonde cleaned up. She had never seen him outside of his gaudy orange jumpsuits when they were younger, and while he had added a lot more black to his ensemble now that he was older, he was still rarely seen wearing anything but one of his signature orange trimmed jackets. It was practically his trademark by now, something that was in fact noted in his bingo book entry. For their night out, the blonde had opted to go for a less traditional outfit. Simple slacks ran all the way down his long legs to a pair of expensive-looking dark leather shoes that had been polished meticulously to a fine pearly sheen. A dark sleek suit jacket hung snugly over his well-built figure, framing a crisp white shirt that he kept casually unbuttoned at the collar to expose just enough flesh to hint at the lithe rippling chest muscle hidden behind the cloth. He had foregone the leaf headband, allowing his naturally spiky blonde hair to flow backwards in a messy but appropriate look given his informal approach to dressing up. The dark green gem that was always on his person hung from his neck like a blinking star, adding to the slight rebellious air about him given his flouting of convention on what was acceptable for formal wear. But she had to admit, he looked damn good doing it. You're welcome. His charming smile was quickly diverted to Mio, who had returned from having put away the roses onto a table kept in the hallway for such displays. And you must be Mio-san. I guess I have you to thank for raising such a lovely daughter. Mio laughed and gave Naruto's shoulder a playful swat. I'd like to think I did most the hard work. Exchanging a quick handshake, the two broke apart as Inoichi cleared his throat. Turning, Naruto gave an apprehensive grin at the stern look he was receiving from the older man. Now I like you, Naruto, began Ino's father steadily, but if I catch even a hint that you're not treating my daughter right, well. The older man trailed off with narrowed eyes before making the signature Yamanaka mind-delving seal. Mio gave him a good whack across the back, dissolving the rather intimidating air he had been putting off when he let out a yelp. Oh, leave him alone, you big brute, scolded the Yamanaka matriarch playfully. Ignore him, Naruto-kun. You and Ino-chan go have fun tonight. The rather murderous look that Inoichi was sending Naruto implied he wanted them to have anything but fun. The older man quickly found himself being pushed out of the living room by his wife, who was telepathically threatening him with a dry spell for the history books if he didn't leave the young couple alone. Pinching the bridge of her nose in humiliation at her parents' antics, Ino opened her eyes again to catch Naruto giving her body a bold unhidden once-over now that her family was no longer present. The Mind Walker smirked as blue orbs finally finished their slow greedy crawl back up to her eyes. So he wasn't entirely a gentleman after all. Well, Ino was aware of that already, given some of the unspeakable things he had done to her that still had her blushing a week later. So where are we going? Seeing as you're all dressed up fancy, I'm guessing we're not going to Ichiraku's, she snarked, falling into the easy routine of ribbing the former class dunce. The offended look on his face prompted Ino to burst out laughing. Oh come on, Ino-chan, Naruto whined. You didn't really think I'd take you to Ichiraku's, did you? Well, he huffed and crossed his arms, pouting childishly. Yeah, well, maybe we will go there. Allowing her giggles to subside, Ino stuck out her tongue mischievously at her fellow blonde. Yeah, well, maybe I'll just stay here then. Snorting, the blonde male stuck his nose up arrogantly and gave a rather impressive sneer back at her. Like you could resist me. The two broke down snickering and spent a good minute swallowing back fits of giggles before calming down again. So where are we going? Ino probed curiously as he held the door open for her. To Kyoto, he replied easily while scanning the front porch of her home. Drawing up to a halt at his reply, she gave him an incredulous look. Kyoto was a neighbor city in Fire Country near Konoha, completely run by civilians unlike the Leaf Village. Due to the lack of military leadership in the city, there was a lot more entertainment and restaurants to be found, as it was primarily a tourist attraction. It wasn't a bad place for a date, but the city also happened to be a good hour away even for a shinobi moving at a steady pace. Naruto, Ino began slowly. Kyoto's like at least 20 miles away. Yeah, it is, he replied distractedly while continuing to scan the crowd of people headed for an evening out. Tapping a heeled foot, Ino crossed her arms with a glare. And how exactly are we supposed to get there? I'm not exactly in running footwear, and even if I were, I'm not running to another city just for a date. Naruto turned around and took one of her hands in his with a gentle tug. Ino felt her anger cool at the kind smile directed at her, finding her eyes captivated by his alluring baby blues. Damn him, how did he manage to manipulate her emotions so easily? Hey, trust me a little, yeah. The gentle request was punctuated with an equally soft squeeze from his large warm hands. Giving a huff to shake off the swarm of butterflies that had magically manifested in her stomach, Ino watched curiously as he frowned at the luxurious silver timepiece on his wrist. It seemed he had something planned after all. Okay, so what are we waiting for then? She asked impatiently. As if to answer her question, her ears caught the sound of loud neighing and the deep rhythmic rumble of wheels broken by the almost silent creak of turning spokes. Stepping straight out of a fairy tale, a majestic quartet of snow-white horses turned around the street corner, carrying with them an elegant carriage that practically screamed royalty with its elegant design. People hurriedly moved out of the way of the important-looking carriage, breaking up into whispers as the vehicle pulled up to the Yamanaka home. Ino couldn't help but gasp as the massive beasts pulled up to a stop before them. Unbidden, her hand reached out to caress one of the well-groomed animal's silky mane. The lead horse snorted nervously and pranced a little at her approach, but calmed at her soothing touch. The chatter of the crowd that had built up in the background fell on deaf ears as Ino delighted at the regal presence of the stallion she was caressing. So sorry, shouted the stately-looking older man in the dark kimono who jumped off the driver's seat. Got a bit turned around, I hope you weren't waiting too long. Naruto rubbed the back of his head nervously, but laughed it off. Well, I was more worried you wouldn't show up, Nagata-san. I go where the boss says, replied the driver simply as he opened the carriage door with a graceful sweep of his hands. And tonight he said you're the boss. Ino couldn't help but feel a burst of excitement as Naruto gestured for her to head in before him. Carefully maneuvering up the steps, she was greeted with the splendid interior, a spacious two-seater bound in the finest leather along with a champagne holder and various other snack foods that looked abhorrently expensive. Plopping herself down and noting how it felt like she had just sat down on a cloud, Ino couldn't help the giddy sensation ballooning inside her as she took a glance at the wine selection on board. There must have been at least a dozen brands from all over the elemental nations, all well stocked and without a price label to make her feel guilty about guzzling them. Her expectations for the evening had already been shattered in the first 5 minutes. Talk about setting the bar high. How in the world did you afford to rent a carriage? She asked in wonderment as Naruto seated himself across from her. Their vehicle started off with a low rumble quickly drowned out by the clopping of horses' hooves. Through the small window Ino spotted the surprised faces of her parents watching from the living room window. Returning their hesitant wave, she gave them a bright smile of reassurance. Oh, I know a guy who knows a guy, Naruto answered evasively. Grabbing a bottle at random, he examined the label with a critical eye before nodding with satisfaction at what he found there. Skillfully popping the cork with little effort, Naruto searched through another drawer looking for something to pour the fine liquor into. Accepting the bubbling glass from her date, Ino gave the vintage an experimental sniff before sipping. Enjoying the way the carbonated quality clashed with the light fruity taste, she smacked her lips in a rather unladylike fashion before turning her attention to the compartment on the side of her seat. Well, you'll have to introduce me to this guy then. Ino exclaimed happily as she rifled through the snack drawer. Greedily snapping up a package of chocolate-covered strawberries hidden between some gourmet confectionaries, the mind-walker let loose a moan of ecstasy as the bitter cocoa mixed beautifully with the sweet zesty juices of the fresh just-picked berries that had been harvested at the zenith of the season. Offering the package to her partner in crime who was busily emptying a bag of what appeared to be pretzel wedges filled with peanut butter, Ino stuffed another of the mouthwatering fruit morsels into her mouth. She had to fight back another groan of pleasure as her taste buds flooded her reward pathways with dopamine. This was almost as good as. Almost. So how am I doing so far? Questioned Naruto cheekily. Oh, I don't know, drawled Ino. She toyed with another strawberry, enjoying the way his eyes hungrily traced the sensual movement against her lips. You're doing okay so far, I suppose. Okay, he squawked indignantly. Who'd you go out with before? The Fire Lord's son. Shuddering slightly at the image of the overweight pudgy pig-like noble that she unfortunately had to protect for one of her missions, Ino stuck her tongue out at Naruto. I happen to have very refined tastes. Rigot. Refined. Might want to wipe off the chocolate from your mouth before you say that, princess, he chided her teasingly. Ino blushed and grabbed a napkin to dab at the corner of her mouth only to find there was nothing there. Tossing the balled-up napkin at a laughing Naruto, she followed up with the first thing within reach, which happened to be her strawberry package. Naruto snatched the improvised projectile from the air, helping himself to 2 berries at once. Hey, Ino whined, those are mine. Come get them then, he taunted while shoveling down another pair of the chocolate-covered snacks, quickly decreasing the size of the already dwindling bag. Lunging across the space between them, Ino made a wild grab for the sack of strawberries only to find them outside her reach as Naruto held them over his head. Cussing his parentage, she hopped onto his lap to gain the leverage necessary to reach her target, fingers scrabbling wildly to snatch back her prize. Ino fell into a paralyzing fit of giggles as Naruto used his free hands to tickle her sides, tears springing to her eyes as he mercilessly assaulted her weak points. No. Stop it, she shrieked as she laughed hysterically. Now giving up on getting her precious back, she tried to squirm off his lap to get away from his searching hands, but found herself trapped in his grip when he brought down his raised arm to hold her in place. Seeing no recourse for escape, Ino fought back the only way she could. By tickling back twice as hard. The 2 blondes struggled against each other, trying to trap the other's hand while keeping one of their own free to attack. After a couple of minutes of back and forth, they finally called a breathless truce when they almost accidentally knocked over Naruto's glass of wine. Capitalizing on Naruto's distraction from keeping the liquid from spilling, Ino snatched back the bag of berries with a triumphant cry. Ha! I win! She gloated. In your face, Uzumaki, said Uzumaki, chuckled and wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her closer to him so that their faces were inches apart. I guess you do, Ino-chan, he whispered huskily. Their faces were so close Ino's nose could pick up the whiff of mint on his breath. She was momentarily overcome with the urge to find out what brand he used by tasting his mouth. Feeling the gooseflesh break out across her arms, the kunoichi fought down a shiver. Staring into the crystal lakes, gazing serenely back at her, Ino swallowed ineffectually while running her tongue across her suddenly very dry lips. Yeah, she whispered back breathlessly, unconsciously leaning forward. The soft smile adorning his youthful features turned into a wicked smirk upon seeing her reaction. Naruto pulled back from Ino, leaving her mortified at her own subconscious reaction to his proximity. Trying to ignore a feeling of disappointment seems to have become a thing for Ino lately. Sliding hurriedly off his lap, and feeling a slight pang of regret at the loss of close contact, Ino decided to stay on his side of the bench. Snatching up glass of wine he had rescued, she emptied it with one swig before shooting her date a haughty look as if that was her response to his challenge. So tell me about yourself, Ino-chan, Naruto said as he turned slightly face her, resting his back against the wall next to the window frame. Leaning back against her side of the carriage, Ino returned his curious look while propping her bare feet on his lap. Her shoes had fallen off during their little wrestling match over the now empty bag of berries and she hadn't bothered putting them back on. Huh, like what? We're on a date to get to know each other, Naruto pointed out dryly with a roll of his eyes. You know, like your likes, dislikes, hobbies, dreams for the future. What is this, like our first team meeting or something? Ino quipped while tossing the empty strawberry bag into a waste bin in a tiny compartment that retracted into the floor of the carriage. Rich people had the neatest toys. Fine, I guess I can run with that. I like watching the sun rise, I always get this feeling of hope in that. I like peanut butter. I don't like bugs, and I hate that stupid cat the Fire Lord's wife owns. My hobbies are working with flowers. I like how calm I feel when I'm putting together a bouquet or tending to the gardens. Oh, and I also like shopping, duh. For the future, well, I'm hoping to find someone to fall in love with and settle down. That and becoming head of the intelligence department. Seeing Naruto's deadpan expression, Ino crossed her arms defensively. What? Don't judge. Just having a flashback to Team 7's first meeting, he replied with a snicker. Well, why don't you tell me about yourself then? Ino huffed. Raising Ino's feet up with one hand, the blonde male briefly crossed his own legs before gently propped hers back on his lap while considering his reply. Well, as you've learned, I like to cook and I like to think I'm pretty good at it too. I also like to write, something I picked up from Jiraiya while I was traveling. Seeing the narrowed eyes of his date, he quickly backpedaled. Not his kind of writing, of course. Oh yeah? Asked Ino after she finally relented her glare. What do you write about then? Action-adventure type novels actually, he chuckled, scratching at his whisker marks in embarrassment. Ino had to resist the sudden urge to rub the back of her hand against his cheek. She had always secretly wondered what those marks would feel like, even all the way back in their academy days. Maybe she'd finally get the chance to satisfy that curiosity. I've got a couple of interested publishers who are taking a look at it. They're loosely based off my own experience working in the field. Ino raised an eyebrow. If even half the stuff she had heard about some of the missions Naruto had been on were true, it'd make for one hell of a reading. The boy was a trouble magnet when it came to misclassified missions or just plain old bad luck. Who the hell managed to run into a legendary missing ninja on their first C ranker? Nothing classified, I hope, she asked. I'm not an idiot, Naruto retorted with a roll of his eyes. Well, go on, she encouraged him with a nudge of her big toe. He poked back at the bottom of her foot, causing her to giggle slightly at the ticklish sensation. Seeing the devilish expression on his face, Ino quickly retracted her feet with a shriek before he could trap them, causing him to laugh. I won't do anything, I promise. Seeing the assuaging gestures he was making, Ino blew a raspberry at him anyways. Oh come on, where's the trust? He moaned dramatically with sad puppy eyes. Conceding, Ino gingerly edged her feet back into his lap, ready to withdraw them in a heartbeat if he showed a hint of taking advantage of her exposed position. Her concerns were waylaid as he turned his body sideways and began to lazily massage her feet. Her body relaxed as his hands seemed to pinpoint every ache and tension in her foot. So what else? She asked while closing her eyes at the pleasant sensation. It was going to be hard not to fall asleep between the tender attention he was paying to her feet and the rhythmic rocking of the carriage. Well, I also like to draw, he said after a moment's thought. I remember, she exclaimed with a laugh. You used to zone out in Aruka's class and doodle comics in your notebook. You saw that? Naruto asked with surprise. You weren't exactly trying to hide it, she snorted. Figured you were too busy fawning over your Sasuke-chan, he retorted, causing her to blush faintly. Her childhood infatuation with the Uchiha was rather embarrassing now that she was older. Sure, he had been the dark, brooding, handsome genius of their year, the sort of guy clueless little girls who hadn't had real experiences in relationship would go for. But now that she was older, Ino really wanted to be able to go back in time and slap her younger self. Beyond just the superficial attraction, there was also the many signs and symptoms pointing at the fact that Sasuke would make for horrible boyfriend material. He didn't pay attention to anyone beyond himself and his problems, arrogance practically oozed off him, he was antisocial and he just wasn't all that nice in general. Plus there was also the whole running away and betraying the village thing. Major point deduction. You weren't any better with Sakura. She shot back. If anything, you were worst. I never stalked her back home, he countered with a smirk. And don't deny it, I saw you do it. Flushing at the accusation that she really couldn't defend herself against, Ino blew out a breath at a strand of hair that had escaped her mother's formation during their tickle war. I was like 12. Besides, what were you doing following me anyways? Now it was Naruto's turn to look slightly embarrassed. I was actually planning to ambush Sasuke and kick his so I could impress Sakura, he admitted abashedly. Ino shook her head and couldn't help but laugh. Guess we both grew up, huh? Naruto smiled sadly as he gazed out at the passing scenery. Yeah, I guess we did. Seeing the nostalgic funk her date had fallen into, Ino felt her own spirits dim somewhat. Things sure had changed a lot since their academy days. Life was simpler in their childhood. It was odd how all those little things that had seemed so important back then were completely inconsequential now. Ino had not seen those girls she had hung out with back in the academy for years now, only occasionally exchanging polite greetings when they passed each other by in the village. Her teammates that had felt like such a burden at the beginning were now closer than family. She wouldn't trade them for anyone else in the world. The vaunted genius of their year who was supposed to do great things had turned into a traitor on equal standing with his brother who was considered one of the most dangerous criminals the Leaf Village had ever produced. The dead last of their year who had had his dreams of being Hokage laughed at and spat upon was now the closest one to inheriting that prestigious mantle even though he had seemingly lost interest in his childhood ambition. Paddling her legs in his lap to shake him out of his peculiar mood, Ino jabbed her foot at his hands demandingly. Naruto looked startled for a moment, as if he had been woken from a trance. Smiling sheepishly at his date, he resumed his massage of her feet, the searing heat from his palms slowly working their way up to her calves. The migration of his hands to the upper parts of her legs was rather distracting to Ino as the intimate motion brought back memories of other locations he had caressed further up her thighs that one night. I guess there's not much else about me you might not know in terms of my likes. I'm a pretty simple guy, Naruto continued. My dislikes. Well, I have to say I've come to hate anything remotely snake-related. I also happen to dislike S-rank missions. Ino sat up straighter at his admission. What? No way. You're like always clamoring for S ranks though. Naruto shrugged. I ask for them because I know I can do them. Anyone else they send might fail, which is no good for the village. But beyond that, S ranks tend to with a straw. You're either sent deep into enemy territory where the expectation for survival is relatively low, or you're sent to take down a target that's pretty much a guaranteed one-way ticket even if you succeed. Intel for S rankers tends to be a joke if you're lucky, and if you're not, well, plus the pay blows camel nuts. It's an S rank though, exclaimed Ino in disbelief. How can the pay? Money goes up with mission ranking. Naruto chuckled darkly. You've never been on an S ranker, have you? That's a common misconception for people who haven't. As you know, we get the majority of our income from going on missions. A cut of the revenue the village receives is divided up between the team that took on the assignment. But that only applies to missions that are being funded and paid for. The majority of AD rankers are problems people are willing to throw money at to make it go away. S rankers generally aren't bankrolled by anyone. They're classified under village security or some other nonsense, Hokage issued and all that. Only thing that applies is hazard pay, and they don't tend to give you too much when your occupation involves throwing yourself headfirst into every dangerous situation that comes along. So what? You're telling me you're getting chump change and genin salary when you're running an S opposite? Ino asked incredulously. That's about right, Naruto said, dark humor evident in his voice. It's why normally only Junin and Anbu take on S rank. It's not just a skill issue. They can afford to get by on their salary even if they don't get a boost to their income from a share of mission profits. Why are you still a genin? Demanded Ino in outrage. You definitely have the skills for Chunin, Junin even. You've been back almost a year now, why haven't you gone for the exam? Hell, why hasn't Tsunade-sama just promoted you? Ah well, Tsunade Bakken asked me to hold back on my promotion so I can join the next Chunin exam that's supposed to be held in Cloud Village next month. I actually registered for it already. Something about needing me to help Konoha flex its muscle a little on the international scene. Ino relented in her anger on her friend's behalf now that she paused to think about it. In a way, it made sense. Naruto was probably the most powerful genin in the world at the moment. He'd smash his way through the competition with ease, building up Konoha's reputation for producing powerful and competent shinobi. The fact that he would be upstaging Cloud on their own turf would be an added bonus politically, as the two villages was still in a somewhat Cold War state after the whole Hyuga kidnapping fiasco. I guess Konoha's reputation could use the help, admitted Ino. We didn't have any stellar showings in the past few years. In fact, the Chunin exam right before Naruto came home had been particularly disastrous for the Leaf Village. Saying their candidate